So we're going to talk now about poetry and the Psalms. Psalms, yes. The Psalter. So there's poetry in the Bible. And it's one of several different types of literary forms or genres. We've talked about some of these earlier. There are different types of writing in the Bible, and the different rules that apply to interpreting each of them. And so you have to know what some of those rules are. And some of you knew rules of poetry when I was talking about roses are red and interpreting it to suggest cannibalism and diabetes. I got strongly corrected by the other Baileys over here, Mark and Marcia. Mark is looking puzzled. He just walked in. He needs a context. You need a context, Mark? Context is important. I'm talking about roses are red, violets are blue, and how you and Marcia helped me figure out that poetry has rules. Now, if you didn't have that context, you'd be wondering, I didn't do anything. But I think Mark knows my heart, that I wouldn't be stabbing him in the back in front of all of these people. So we're talking about literary genres. The different types, you need different rules. So in which books of the Bible can we find poetry? And I think Doug hit this earlier. He asked, and we said Song of Songs and Lamentations, Proverbs, Psalms, Ecclesiastes, large portions of the prophets, most of Job, aside from the narrative portions at the beginning and the end. And indeed, throughout narrative books, indeed, in parts of the New Testament, you can find poetry. Now, I won't get into that. Poetry comprises about a third of the entire Bible. It's therefore a significant part of the scriptures which we need to understand how to read properly if we're going to correctly handle God's words. So what is poetry? It's a literary work in which special intensity is given to the expression of feelings and ideas by the use of distinctive style and rhythm. What is this distinctive style? How do you recognize a piece of writing as poetry? How can you tell something is poetry? Go ahead, Christine. Rhymes, okay, certainly. In a lot of poetry, not all, but rhyme, I think for most of us is what we would look for to know something is a poem. Yes, Trevor?
Lines are repeated.
Lines are repeated throughout it. There's repetition. Yes, Marlon? You did some English in school, didn't you? I remember that when you were at university. Yeah, so the use of literary devices, personification, and he mentioned some others, similes. Yes, Marland?
Usually highly subjective.
Highly subjective, and by that you mean?
Mean by the writer's perspective.
Okay.
Trying to get what the writer.
Okay, so I sense you're saying it's not as logical, it's more feelings based than it is, these are the facts. CNN. Yes, Shelley?
It doesn't necessarily follow the structure of complete sentences.
Right,
Like what we close,
right,
just the fragments of a thought.
right.
It doesn't necessarily follow I don't want to say grammatical.
Yes, right. The-
Different style.
Right. So it's not necessarily following the usual grammatical rules. The sentences tend to be shorter, more terse, and they take, shall we say, a little bit of poetic license in how they put things together. Yeah? I saw some other hands. Robert, and then Lisa, and then I'll come to Marlon up front. Written in stanzas. Thank you very much. Yeah? Yeah. Great. Great. Yeah. Okay. There's a lot of metaphorical language. Any other ideas? I think it's pretty good. It's pretty good. So there's rhyme, there's rhythm or meter, like I'll get to that in a second. Stanzas, like someone mentioned, figurative language, literary devices tends to be emotive. It's defined as a piece of writing that partakes of the nature of both speech and song that is nearly always rhythmical, usually metaphorical, and often exhibits such formal elements as meter, rhyme, and stanzaic structure. That's what we all said. So here's this poem that many of us learned. 1, 2, buckle my shoes. 3, 4, shut the door. 5, 6, pick up sticks. 6, 7, 8, lay them straight. 9, 10, and that's the end. I learned it begin again. Big fat hen. That doesn't even make sense. You guys need lunch. So, do you hear it though? Bop, 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 ba-dop. Bop, 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 ba-dop. Do you hear that? That's the meter or the rhythm. We in Jamaica, we use a D, rhythm. All right? Now, why is poetry used in parts of the Bible? I think maybe it's because it's easier to remember than prose. Song lyrics are easier to remember than sentences from a book. Many of us learned this when we were children, still with us. And I think God wants His Word to remain with us. And I think much of the Bible was written in cultures where people's mostly would be exposed to it orally. I think that's a part of what God was trying to accomplish. And also, I think it's intended to move us emotionally. Doug used the image of a picture and how you absorb a picture as opposed to a statement. So I think poetry is there to express powerful emotion. I came across this quote when I was preparing a lesson similar to this in Barbados. And this guy, he says, art becomes a voice that we use when we can't say something vital and important and powerful in an ordinary voice. See, poetry helps us to express deep, powerful, profound, important emotions when our ordinary speech just doesn't seem good enough. I think of when I was dating my wife. I write her poems all the time. I still write poems. She's not in the room. She'll agree if she were here. But I wrote those poems because I had deep, powerful emotions. And I could find no other way of expressing them than to notch up the expression to a level above the ordinary. You guys know what I mean, don't you? When my children were born, I wrote a poem. Because it was just such an incredible moment in my life. Nothing else could do to express what I was feeling. I remember late last year, Devon's dad passed away. And I remember seeing him send out an email with a song he wrote to his mom. It was around Christmas. And I remember as I saw his email, I think I knew what was going on with him. Because my dad had passed a couple years earlier, and I remember the tremendous emotions that I felt. And I understand, he's an artist. The emotions that he felt had to be expressed in an artistic way. And that's what I think is happening with poetry in the Bible. At significant points in Israel's history, when words were not enough to express and to convey their emotions, they'd reach for poetry and songs, like Miriam's song after God rescued them by bringing them through the Red Sea. Yep. If you were there, you'd have to write a song. It was that kind of a moment. And I think of in our own lives, we can think of times that we felt things that there's a song that just captured it. I remember when my dad was, after he had his stroke, and it was a really tough time in my life. And I remember coming home one evening and from the hospital, and quite frankly, I was depressed. And I sat on the couch, and my daughter, Chelsea, I can't remember how old she was at the time. She was watching Joseph, King of Dreams, and the song started playing, You Know Better Than I. And I just sat on the couch, and I started just silently crying because I was feeling just such a tremendous sense of angst at God and the situation that He had put me in. And there were no words anywhere else that could express it And that song, as I sat there, it just captured how I felt and took me to another place. I'll never forget that. I've got that song on my iPad. I play it from time to time to remind me of that moment in my life. And I think that's how poetry in the Bible functions. It captures strong emotions and conveys them across generations. Grant Osborne in his book says, Semitic poetry had its origin in the religious life of the people, both corporate and individual. Prose was inadequate to express the deep yearnings of the soul, and poetry as an emotional, deep expression of faith and worship became a necessity. He's saying the same thing that I just said. And this means when you read poetry, you need to be especially alert to how it is meant to affect your emotions and to be aware it is emotive language. You got to read not just with your head, you got to read with your heart as well. You've got to understand as well that I think what Marland was saying, when you talked about it being subjective, what he's saying is this writer, he's expressing how he feels. And I think about how sometimes my wife will say to me, "You never," and "you always." And I've been taught in marriage classes in this church that you never say never, and you never say always. So I go into my discipling time with Peter and Sandy Swaby, and I am confident I'm right. And I say, "She said never." And she said always. And then Sandy will say, "Well, Courtney, don't you know she's a woman? She's allowed." Read between the lines. She's expressing how she feels. And then I don't hear anything else in DP time after that. I'm kidding. I trust these guys. I listen. It's kind of hard getting that one down my throat, but But you got to read poetry understanding it is emotive language. Since the Bible is an effective book that communicates much of its meaning by moving the feelings and the will of its readers, readers must be careful not to depoetize its form by ignoring its literary conventions. An understanding of its unique literary dynamics will not only heighten the enjoyment, but will also enable interpreters to hear the poet's thoughts more clearly. Look at Nahum chapter 3. All you electronic Bible people now are challenged. And I got an electronic Bible as well. I'm talking because, I'm hoping as a teacher I'm not embarrassed of here finding Nahum. I'm kidding. I know the general direction it is. I'll put my hand on it in a second. I got it. Praise God. All right, Nahum 3. Look at that. Hopefully in your Bible it's set out, it looks like poetry. Woe to the city of blood, full of lies, full of plunder, never without victims. The crack of whips, the clatter of wheels, galloping horses and jolting chariots, charging cavalry, flashing swords and glittering spears, many casualties, piles of dead, bodies without number, people stumbling over the corpses. All because of the wanton lust of a prostitute, alluring the mistress of sorceries who enslaved nations by her prostitution and peoples by her witchcraft. Just the way it's set out gives you immediately a sense of speed. You can almost hear the galloping of the horses and just how the verses, the lines that are short, boop, 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 boop. And you get the idea as well with this speed of confusion. You're hardly able to process one line before the next is on you. You're being transported into the heart of the battle. The confusion that's taking place as God is bringing his judgment on Nineveh. I wish I could develop that some more, but I hope you get the sense. There is more than the words on the page. There is to be an affection of your feelings. Does that make sense? Features of poetry in the Bible, Hebrew poetry, puns, wordplay, like God made Adam, and Adam, sounds similar to Adamah, which refers to soil. God made him from the soil. And, Moses, his name means to draw out. There's a lot of that. It's hard for us to see a lot of it because we're reading in English. But sometimes we get help with the little footnotes at the bottom of the page. You ought to read those. There's repetition, alliteration. And alliteration is the occurrence of the same letter or sound at the beginning or closely connected words. Yeah, somebody was saying something? Big black bull, or she sells seashells by the seashore. I got it done. Or assonance, it's similar, but they use vowels like true blue shoe. You got metaphor, simile, which we could talk about. Like a simile is like Psalm 1:3. He's like, something is like something else. He's like a tree. And then it develops that image. Or a quarrelsome wife is like a constant dripping on a rainy day. We know that she's not dripping, she's like that. Okay? I won't tarry on that verse. I don't want to precipitate marital disunity. Some of these husbands are something is like something else in a metaphor, but you don't have the like. It's treated almost as if it is. The Lord is my shepherd. We know that God is not a shepherd with a rod walking around. It's a picture. The tongue that brings healing is a tree of life. There's not a tree growing out of your mouth. You get the idea. Proverbs 12:4. Can you identify what figure of speech is being here? Is this metaphor or simile? Both. It's a trick question. So the first line is a metaphor, and the second one, simile. Then Marlon mentioned personification. So human attributes are given to something non-human as animals. So send forth your light and your truth. They're being personified like, you can send them out like missionaries. Surely goodness and love will follow me. Goodness and love are personified. They're actually following. Okay? Parallelism. Now, I think this is the most important thing that you've got to grasp about Hebrew poetry. And this affects our interpretation. Fee and Stewart refer to it as thought rhyme. By that, they mean that in Hebrew, it wasn't sound rhyme, but what they would do is they would match thoughts. So you'd have parallel thoughts. So one line of the poem quite often matches another line by corresponding to each other. And they correspond either by being similar, and that's called synonymous parallelism, or sometimes they contrast each other or opposite to each other. That's called antithetical parallelism. And in some cases, one builds on the other, and that's called synthetic parallelism. And then you've got some other forms like the numerical ones. You know these. On the 6 things, the earth trembles. Under 7, it falls off its axis. You know the verse. It doesn't say that. I'm paraphrasing. And so there are all these different forms. So some examples. Isaiah 44:22. I've swept away your offenses like a cloud, your sins like the morning mist. Notice that though they are quite similar, your offenses are being swept away like a cloud. The second line, it almost intensifies the idea by saying that we're not just sweeping away like a cloud, it's like the morning mist. There's the idea now that it's passing. Not only is it ephemeral, it's not much, but like the morning mist suggests that it's not sticking around for long. That's how God is with our sin. He doesn't hold on to it and say, give me a month to think about it. He's not like me, mulling over whether I'm going to give up the slides. He is willing to sweep it away like the morning mist. Or Proverbs 17:4, a wicked man listens to evil lips, a liar pays attention to a malicious tongue. So there's a repetition of the ideas of evil lips and malicious tongue, but there is some intensification in that we know what he means by a wicked man. In the second verse, he means a liar. Do you see that? And we see that evil lips here corresponds to a malicious tongue. He's narrowing the focus. Okay? Next one, Proverbs 1:8. Listen, my son, to your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. Now, that doesn't mean that there's some difference between father and mother. He's really just using both parents, is what he's doing. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars you've set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him? So, heavens is parallel to moon and the stars, and the work of your fingers is parallel to what you've set in place. So, when he's talking about heaven, he's not talking about the place of God's heavenly dwelling. He's talking about the moon and the stars. And he's saying, when he says they're the work of your fingers, the point he's making, you put them in place. What is man that you're mindful of him? The Son of Man, that you care for him. So he cares, he's mindful of man, but cares for the Son of Man. Is that what that means? No. Man and Son of Man are the same. Okay? But if you don't understand that this is the way the poetry works, you can miss that. And to be mindful of him means care for him. Okay? There are other examples. Take the garment of one who puts up security for a stranger, holding pledge if he does it for a wayward woman. And Fee and Stewart, I think, point to this in making the point that if we're not careful, we can overinterpret. We can say, oh, well, for the one who puts up security for the stranger, you take his garment, but you hold it in pledge for the wayward woman. No, that's not what, they're parallel. You understand what I'm saying? I can't develop that more because of time. The heavens declare the glory of God, Psalm 19:1, and we could read that. And I think, for some people, if you're not careful, you can overinterpret that. Let's look at that quickly. Psalm 19, verse 1. Check what time I have left. Like I tell you, as I get older, it's harder to do several things at the same time. Yeah. So. Oh, yeah, that's easy. Good. I have enough time. Psalm 19, verse 1. You guys still with me? Yeah. Don't throw in the corner, man. Don't worry. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge. They have no speech. They use no words. No sound is heard from them. Yet their voice goes out into all the earth. Their word to the end of the world. And it continues. So it's not saying the heavens do one thing and the skies another. Proclaim the work of his hands and declare the glory of God. They are two ways of saying the same thing. And you could drill down into this some more. It's the same thing. You don't say, well, pouring forth speech is different than revealing knowledge. They're parallel. And what you may find is it gets fine-tuned or tightened or explained. But with synonymous parallelism, what we're dealing with is the same idea expressed in two different ways. Okay? And there's a form of it called emblematic parallelism. And where what you find is, like we looked at Psalm 23, I hope I brought it back. Well, let me define it. One member of the line contains a figurative metaphor simile development of the same thought. Explanation. So Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, is parallel to I shall not be in want. So the idea here is that God is my shepherd. What does this mean? It means he cares for us. I shall not be in want. Are you guys following me? Now, it takes a little bit more thinking, but if you appreciate the parallelism, then you're better able to understand what is being conveyed. And if you don't, you can not only miss it, you can misinterpret. So here's another one. Yet for your sake we face death all day long. We're considered as sheep to be slaughtered. Sheep to be slaughtered, he means we face death all day long. Antithetical. Second or subsequent line contrasts the thought of the first, often reinforcing the first line by contrast. Very easy to identify. Usually there's a but. That may be useful for you on the test. So they do not cry out to me from their heart, but wail upon their beds. So the idea is that these guys, all their wailing is not from their hearts. It's a different, the but means it's a different type of crying. All it is action. It's not from the heart. The meaning could only be discovered in the contrast. I don't know what happened there. And then Hosea 17:4, same slide. Oh, I see, I'm blocking it out. I know. Here are a couple more. Wicked men are overthrown and are no more. Notice the but. The house of the righteous stand firm. A prudent man keeps his knowledge to himself, but the heart of fools blurts out folly. Okay? Synthetic, what is happening is that one line is building on the next. So deliverers will go up to Mount Zion to govern the mountains of Esau. This is a new thought being built because we're still going up, but they're going up, we're told now, to govern, and the kingdom will be the Lord's. So they don't contrast with each other. They're not the same, but one line is building on another, and sometimes you have another one building on that too. Yeah? Yeah, take a breath. It's okay. You have time to process this. And I think basically all you really need to know for the exam is to know what the different ones are. Easy way to remember it. One is it's the same. One is its opposite. And the other one is not like the other two. Or really, to be more precise, it's building. Make sense? All right, here's some more examples. Psalm 1:3 is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season, and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever he does prospers. So we're building. Tree, that's one image, yields its fruit. Its leaf does not prosper. They're building. Or vinegar to the teeth and smoke to his eyes, sluggard to those who send him. And there's climatic. And this is a form of synthetic parallelism where they not only build, but they develop a thought line upon line. Like Psalm 133, verse 2. We can look at that quickly. It is like precious oil poured on the head, running down on the beard. So we're going down instead of up here. Running down on Aaron's beard, down on the collar of his robe. It is as if the dew of Hermon were fallen on Mount Zion, for their Lord bestows his blessed even life evermore. So you see what they're doing is it's not just building, but it's going somewhere. Boop, boop. In this case, they're going down as opposed to up, which is interesting because it's a song of ascent as they're going up to Jerusalem. But as they're going up, I think the psalmist is saying that how they get unified is by going down. There's a lot there. And I mentioned this before, numerical parallelism, and you usually have three things, and then the fourth. It's not that I think the idea is the emphasis is on the fourth thing. I think that's the point. Okay? Here's another example of that, but I've got to move on. What's the point? So that we're smart and we know some big words that we can use. Synthetic parallelism. That's not the point. The point is not to impress. It's to help us with interpretation because we avoid over-interpretation, and it also helps us to figure out what the writer means to say. Now, Proverbs 10:19 is an example of this. Sister who is in this room, I'm happy to see, asked me at midweek after one of the Philippian classes what it meant. And as I quite often say, well, I'd have to study to know. I said, let me look at it. So I went home that night, and I had a look at it. So what do these words mean? Question. Just these words. When words are many, sin is not absent. What's that, Shelley? You talk too much, so you're bound to sin. Any other thoughts? Yeah, Marlon? Okay. All right. One popular interpretation I've heard is Anybody who talk too much, there is some sin there. Where there is smoke, there is fire. And so some of those loquacious Christians, anytime you get to an appointment with her, you know, she just talk. You can't even get a word in. You guys have heard anything like that before? Yeah? Yes. Ah, I see. So that's, methinks he doth protest too much. In other words, you know, there's something going on. I don't think that's what this verse is saying. Okay? If you look at the verse, what type of parallelism is it? Hint, hint. It's antithetical. All right? There's that but. When words are many, sin is not absent, but he who holds his tongue is wise. So the idea is the two thoughts are opposed to each other. Okay? Now, what it's saying then is when words are many is opposite to holding the tongue. In other words, it's referring to someone who talks too much or is unrestrained in their speech. Do you see that? Sin is not absent, is not being contrasted. The point is not you talk. Is not that you talk too much. You got some sin to hide, but that sin is not absent. It's being contrasted to being wise. This suggests that the sin being referred to is a sin that results from not being wise by holding your tongue. I wrote this. In other words, when you talk too much, sin is going to be present, but he who holds his tongue is wise by contrast. Now, reading different translations would have helped you here. So here's the NIV 2011. I think they try to correct the misunderstanding that could come from reading it earlier. Sin is not ended by multiplying words, but the prudent hold their tongues. Then the NET, when words abound, transgression is inevitable, but the one who restrains his words is wise. When there are many words, sin is unavoidable, but the one who controls his lips is wise. Too much talk leads to sin. Be sensible and keep your mouth shut. Which end of the spectrum is that on? Looser. The more talk, the less truth. The wise measure their words. When words are many, transgression is not lacking, but whoever restrains his lips is prudent. Let's move on. So how should we take the Bible? Should we take it literally or figuratively? Sometimes we say, I take the Bible literally. Really? All of it? So when God says the cattle on 1,000 hills are his, does that mean only 1,000 hills? That's what it says, literally, isn't it? Okay? So when it says that the wicked go astray from birth, there's that verse where it says that, from the womb they're lying. They're abnormal babies. They come out, doctor, I like you, No, that doesn't make sense. But do we take all of it figuratively? When it says Jesus died and rose again on the third day, is that a metaphor? No. That literally happened. And so you've got to know how to read different passages. I think a useful way of describing it, and I got this from Doug, we would take the Bible at face value. That's what we really mean to say. What it means to say is what we take it to mean. And so some parts we have to read figuratively, and some parts we have to read the other way. So Psalm 51, verse 5, surely I was sinful at birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me. NIV, I was shaped in iniquity and in sin did my mother conceive me. So what does that mean? That when you are born, in fact, from the time that you were conceived, from conception, you're sinful. Now, I don't know how, what kind of sin you'd get up to in the womb, but if you read it literally, you could justify original sin. From I'm born, I sin. But what's the context? First of all, this doesn't agree with the Bible. We know this passage, Ezekiel 18:20, which teaches that we're morally culpable for our own sin and not the sin of our parents. And there's others, but we got to look at the context. We know what's happening. David has sinned with Bathsheba. He feels utterly sinful. And he's moving his feeling of guilt all the way back. It's subjective, as a brother said. It's emotive language. He's trying to convey, I feel like the scum of the earth. That's what he's trying to say when he says that I was sinful at birth. I'm such a sinner. Man, from even I was in the womb, I must have been sinning. I'm worse than everybody else. He's using a hyperbole. I'm sorry? Exaggeration, yeah. Another word for the same thing. Thank you. Psalm 22, verse 9, you brought me out of the womb. You made me trust in you even at my mother's birth. Can babies trust? I don't think so. I mentioned Psalm 58:3 earlier. Psalm 114, I don't think we have the time to, if we have the time, I can come back and take you through a psalm and how the parallelism can actually help. But I do want to use the rest of the time that I have to talk quickly about the Psalms. Psalms are, of course, these Psalms are the longest book of the Bible. It's 8%. It's got the longest and the shortest chapters. Longest chapter is? And the shortest is? Right? And the very middle of the Bible is Psalm 118. Very interesting. It's the most quoted Old Testament book in the New Testament, and that's ahead of Isaiah and Deuteronomy. It's arranged, as Doug mentioned, into 5 books written over maybe a 500-year span. And the books are likely arranged at different points. So, for example, you'll hear it says, here ended this, and, then you get another book. Or there'll be parts that are repeated. And so it's quite clear that somebody didn't sit down and write them and put them all together. You had all these different Psalms, and they were collected and put together over a period of time. I think the 5 books are intended to mirror the 5 books of the Torah. And so this is kind of like a reflection on Torah that is more Torah by Torah, I mean the law, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. And it's a reflection that is perhaps more emotive and intended to affect feelings, etc. It's written by different people. Most of the Psalms are ascribed to David. There are 12 to Asaph, sons of Korah. There are 2 ascribed to Solomon. There's Psalm 90, which is ascribed to Moses, one of my favorite. And I think it plays a pivotal role in the structure of the Psalms, which unfortunately I can't get into today. And then there are about 51, which are called orphan Psalms, meaning they're anonymous. They're not pegged to anyone. So what are Psalms? They're musical poems. And Fee and Stewart said the most important thing to remember in reading or interpreting Psalms is that they're poems, musical poems. Richard asked me during the break, Wallace, he asked me, well, how do you read a Psalm knowing its music? And I said, it's kind of like reading Bob Marley, the lyrics without the music. We know there's music, and the music notches it up because the music affects us as well. But even if we don't have the music, we can get a sense of what feelings are being which the writer intends to convey by the words itself. All right. So the word psalm, to give you the fast version, means to pluck, to sing, a song accompanied with plucking. The Hebrew title really means praises. And I think because they are musical poems, it should mean that we slow down when we read them. Kind of like Doug was saying, you don't just glance at a picture, at a portrait, you look at it. And that's what we've got to do as we read the Psalms. They're meant to affect our emotions. And we've got to interact with them on an emotional level and allow them to engage our emotions. A musical poem cannot be read in the same way as an epistle or a narrative or a selection of law. It is intended to appeal to the emotions, to evoke feelings rather than propositional thinking, and to stimulate a response on the part of the individual that goes beyond a mere cognitive understanding of certain facts. That's what I just said a while ago. I think you also need to be careful about trying to read the Psalms looking for doctrine. That's not what the intention is. It's emotive language to express feelings, and you need to be careful you don't treat it literally. The Psalms are the journals of the spiritual journey of the people of God throughout the ages. So it's like somebody were to look into your quiet time notebook and to take out all that you felt and to put it down for someone to read. And I think God is trying to help us to understand from learning from the people that went before us how we can deal with all the range of emotions that we feel in our relationship with Him. The Psalms are God's word to man, but they start by being man's word to God. So there are 5 books. There's a movement from lament to praise. The earlier books are mostly, laments, and laments are, like Doug said, dirges or sad poems, let's call them that, to praise. So more sad ones in the beginning, and then you get to the end, there's more praise. And I think that's our movement, isn't it? We generally start out, as we go through challenges, it's sad, but usually we get to the other side of it with God, and regardless of how it works out, we're filled with praise. I've shared before that after my dad died, that was a difficult 2 years for me, and I remember just being at his interment, and after we laid him to rest, going out and looking over Old Harbor Bay with my family, and the word just came out of my bowels all the way up. God is good. Because I understood that God had walked with me all the way through. All right, so there's a movement from Davidic to non-Davidic Psalms, and a movement from Davidic kingship to the kingship of Yahweh. And this is interesting. I think one of the things that you see is there's this big focus, like in Psalm 2, on the Davidic king, and all these promises, and then you get to about 80-something, God, you've abandoned us, and they've come in, they destroyed the temple. Where's the king? It's all going, downhill. And then Psalm 90 opens, Lord, you have been our dwelling place from all eternity. In other words, the real king is you. You are the real temple. You are the real place of our dwelling. And there's an increase in the number of Psalms that talk about God as king. So there's a message even in the structure. There's a lot to study here. So you read the Psalms, you want to read in context, like we talked about earlier today, the historical context, the literary context. You want to read the entire Psalm. You want to remember its poetry. Remember that it's a Psalm. You need to look at what type of Psalm it is. I'm going to take you through that quickly. Historical context, one of the things that's very good is the superscriptions at the beginning, like Psalm 51 tells us it was after David sinned with Bathsheba. And that may lead you to 2 Samuel 11, and you can study that out. You put the Psalm in an actual context. Richard was telling me about a Psalm, I'm not sure which one it is, but he says it's a dedication of the temple. Something like that can give you a context for the Psalm. So you want to read the entire Psalm, as I said. Remember its point, remember it's a Psalm, what type of Psalm it is. There are different types, and each of them serves a different purpose. There are laments, which express, some of them are individual, some are corporate. The numbers are the different Psalms that fall in this category. And they express the sadness. And times I think were often hard for the Israelites, as they are for many of us. As we get older, harder things happen. Life becomes more difficult. And sometimes we can't have quiet times where we're saying to God, oh God, I'm fired up, because we are not. And we need to be able to say, God, I'm angry, I'm sad, my heart is broken. And God has recorded these Psalms for us to know it's okay to be as forceful in our expression about our pain in our relationship with God. And the great thing about them all is they end, except that one, I think Psalm 88 or 89, they end on a note of trust and confidence in God. Okay? Next Psalm. What did I do? All right, Thanksgiving Psalms, okay? And those are, as they sound, hymns of praise, salvation history Psalms, Psalms of celebration and affirmation. These are some categories that Fee and Stewart use. Wisdom Psalms, songs of trust. One of our favorites is Psalm 23, Psalms of ascent, like 133, which we read earlier. Acrostic Psalms, like Psalm 119, where, it's like in English, if you were to start with A, and the first 8 verses are all beginning with A, and then the second 8 are all beginning with B. And if you open your Bible to Psalm 119, they'll actually show you the actual Hebrew letter that is being used. And so these are carefully crafted psalms. Hallelujah psalms, and this is how the Psalter closes out with a note of praise. And then there are the imprecatory psalms. Imprecatory psalms. To imprecate means to pray against, and these are psalms of revenge. So here's a man, there's a baby, he's going to smash this baby on the ground. It's called psalms of revenge, and there are a number of them. We know these. Arise, O Lord, deliver me, O my God. Strike all my enemies on the jaw. Break the teeth of the wicked. Fire upon them, jaw. You know? Going on here. Break the teeth in their mouths, O God. Tear out, O Lord, the fangs of the lions. Let them vanish like water that flows away. And when they draw the bow, let their arrows be blunted. Wow. This is a Christian? He's not done. Like a slug melting away as it moves along, like a stillborn child. May they not see the sun. He's got a lot of feeling here. Before your pots can feel the heat of the thorns, when they be green or dry, the wicked will be swept away. And the righteous will be glad when they are avenged, when they bathe their feet in the blood of the wicked. What do you do with that? Is that, this is what I pray when my boss at work give me a hard time. Just drop his name in there. Is that what you use it for? And here's the most famous one. Remember, O Lord, what the Edomites did on the day Jerusalem fell. Tear it down, they cried. Tear it down to its foundations, O daughter of Babylon, doomed to destruction. Happy is he who repays you for what you've done to us. He who sees your infants and dashes them against the rocks. Context of this is the destruction of Jerusalem. It's besieged, invaded, the temple, a symbol of national unity. It's destroyed. The city was burned. People were slaughtered. Women were raped. Loved ones were wounded and in captivity. Children were sold into slavery. How would you feel? I think you'd have very strong emotions. You'd need some poetry to express those emotions. And not roses or red type of poetry. This type of poetry. This is how the Americans felt when those planes flew into those buildings. This is how the Malaysians feel this morning about their loved ones on that plane that's down. And God understands this. He understands our humanness. And he preserves these psalms for us to know, bring it to me. Just as it is. I can take it. Don't put it up. Lay it all out. Because if you keep it in, it's going to chew you up. What can we learn? We need to learn firstly that we can be honest with God and not stuff our feelings. We can learn secondly to take it to God. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord. We need to leave vengeance to the Lord. Plead our case to God and leave it in his hands. And then we need to recognize that though we feel that way, that's not where we need to stop. Jesus is the example of where we need to get to, which is to love your enemies. Which when he was being dealt with unfairly, he said, Father, forgive them, because they know not what they do. Doug suggests that the imprecatory psalms are sub-Christian, meaning spiritually immature, meaning we've got some ways to go from there. There are other views. I like that one. The point is, if we're not here like Jesus, we need to be honest about that with God, about where we really are. But if we're not there, we need to head to where Jesus is. So that's the Psalms. Here's some books on the Psalms. Fee and Stewart, How to Read the Bible for All Its Worth. I'll leave them up. I've added to that list this morning Doug's book, Thrive, which is on the Psalms. I haven't read it, but I glanced through it last night, and I thought, great, compact. Some of us don't like big books. This will fix your wagon. It'll be great. And there are other things. And Doug has a number of his books and materials out there on the table. He's selling his stuff at 2/3 the actual cost. 1/3. 1/3. 1/3. That's even better than I thought. So, snarf it up. Snarf it up. All right. We've got time for a couple of questions. Any questions, comments on the Psalms? Yes, Marlon.
What can you tell us about the sons of Korah?
Yeah. You remember a guy called Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, is it? They're descendants of him. So it seems someone was left after the earth opened up and swallowed them all up. Maybe the all was not literally all. but they're descendants of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Korah, really. Yeah, that's as much as I could. Unless, Doug, you had anything you'd add to that? No? That's good. Someone survived.
What a surprise.
Yeah, quite often happens. Yes, Bradley.
Someone once told me that how they read the Bible, their quiet time is they start with a Psalm, then they move to a proverb, and then they go to the New Testament and read some of the epistles. First question is that a good way to do it? And secondly, he said that the Psalms should affect me at the emotional level. If you're reading the Psalms and are not affecting in that way, is it best to stop reading them and move on to something else? Or is there something wrong with why they're not affecting?
Well, I say a couple of things. Firstly, how you can read the Bible in different ways. I'd be hesitant to prescribe a formula, but there may be a value in praying. There's a time I would pray through a psalm every day, and sometimes it's great to. I think Psalms and Proverbs are things that you can use on a daily basis. I would say that. And as far as how it affects us, I would say keep reading it until it affects you more. And maybe sometimes it's how you are reading it and being open to being affected. And the other thing you need to realize is that we all progress at different levels emotionally. When I just became a Christian, I remember sharing, boy, my heart is hard. I don't cry at anything. And, Paul Williams said to me, don't worry, bro, the tears will come. I'm 40-something now, and I can hardly make it through the communion service without tearing up. The point I'm making is where you're at is where you're at. Just keep doing what's right. God will work on you and make you more emotional if you're open to it. All right, I'm going to have to stop here because I do want you to have your hour and a half.